afternoon, everyone. My name is BeckyQuintal, and I'm here today at this conference, but also in the design criticism program in general, because architecture is sometimes misunderstood. And I started to wonder why, and my initial research focused on architecture criticism in the mainstream press, or the place where most people get whatever, if any, information about architecture. I thought that maybe critics, journalists, or reporters weren't doing it justice, so to speak. But the further I pushed and the more projects that I read about, it started to become clear that maybe the problem wasn't with the critics after all. What about the architects themselves? What's their role in delivering their projects to the public? So I decided to practice design criticism a little differently, achieving what I'd ultimately like to see, a public with a greater appreciation for new architecture, by going to the top first. So the delivery of architecture will inevitably flow from the architect to the public, but how can the critical techniques that we're learning today help the architect communicate so that the output that reaches the media can be better evaluated and understood? And I know that the diagram may seem a little scary, and it might look like I'm suggesting a relationship that takes autonomy away from the architect, or that the critic then becomes too removed from the public. But that's why there's an asterisk, because this role that I'm speaking about hasn't been defined in our current understanding of this delivery system. So how did I get to all of this? Well, the project that I'll briefly introduce today, the Bicentennial Tower, became the departure point for this study because it exemplified some of the things that are particularly frustrating in the communication of architecture. In July 2007, a press release hit the newswires announcing the design of Latin America's tallest building, a project commissioned by Mexican real estate company Grupo Danjos with the support of Mexico City's government. Now, officials saw the building of this 70-story tower designed by Dutch architect Wim Koolhaas and his firm OMA, Office for Metropolitan Architecture, as an effort to assert the city's relevance as an emerging economic and cultural force. It would also serve as a monument to 200 years of independence from Spain, thus the name the Bicentennial Tower. Planned at the edge of Mexico City's largest park and entrance to the Grand Boulevard, Paseo de la Reforma, the Bicentennial Tower was to be built in an area otherwise surrounded by low-rise buildings. And the client ultimately hoped that a building of this magnitude could attract investors and bring much-needed activity to the Mexican economy. Further reinforcing the tower's relationship to the bicentennial and the history of Mexico, it was touted as being influenced by traditional pre-Columbian pyramids. For design enthusiasts, this tower represented an overdue foray into the world of cutting-edge building in Latin America. But 95% of the citizens who lived near the site of the tower were against its construction. It was dismissed as hideous and even nicknamed Vicente Gorda, gorda meaning fat. And its form really lent itself well to being parodied. Political cartoons used the shape of the tower to criticize the mayor. And at the top cartoon it says, "Now where will I bury it?" meaning it looks like a coffin. So the supporting visual material that OMA gave out to the press seemed to sustain unfavorable opinions, depicting a tower vastly taller than any other structures that surrounded it. And in this shot here, it's seen at night. There's a lot of clouds in the sky. It looks kind of gloomy, not a very welcoming image. And the image that was selected to represent the tower in the daylight has a shadowy, anonymous figure in the foreground, and this mundane skyscraper, apparently mundane skyscraper, with a bulging midsection. And there's so few clues, if any, that this is Mexico City. It's the blue sky, a park, and anonymous mid-rise city buildings. And where is that influence of pre-Columbian architecture? So unfortunately for the architect and client, even mentioning that tie-in with the architecture of Mexico's indigenous people didn't supply enough reassurance, nor did it make up for the complex battle over zoning, preservation, and the city politics that permeated the projects mentioned in the media. So the way in which this saga unfolded provides a point of departure for a larger discourse, one that brings the architect's role as communicator, public intellectual, and educator into sharper focus. Every text and image that emerges from a practice functions as a tool so that those outside of the firm can understand and ultimately support or dismiss a design. Taking a closer look at examples of architectural output, whether especially tailored for certain media outlets or not, reveals that many architects, and in this case in particular OMA, fail to address issues of public communication within their work. This is done with complex text-based releases, visual materials that show buildings as sculpture in a landscape, and it's very disappointing because what the media sees prior to a building's construction seems to further emphasize the idea that architects really aren't that interested in their role as in their role as public educators. This is what OMA released to the media in July of 2007. The story I just told you that used all of those other diagrams and images was supposed to be communicated with just these 5. So in a way, OMA reduced the way its architecture was going to be understood from the very deployment of its project into the media. As long as architects and scholars contend that the concepts and conditions that drive their designs and theories are too complex to be accepted or understood in the public arena, they forfeit the opportunity to garner support for their work. This is especially troubling since architecture serves everyone, not just people inside of the profession. Policy and laws, like architecture and design, shape our built environment. And when an architect tries to present innovative or groundbreaking design, an integral part of that process is going to be convincing people to change policies or to implement new ones. And because this was a project that was in the city, it's a very common occurrence, the relationship between existing buildings to new buildings. And because of that, it's very important that diagrams and arguments and convincing arguments are embedded in the actual design process themselves. So this, and like I say, I reiterate that this is an important thing for architects because it's not just about the shape of the building or the way it looks, but it looks that way for a reason, and that may seem very obvious, but at times that's kind of overlooked. And that reason may be complex, and it's likely the result of many months or even years of research, and only possible because of advanced technology. But is our only recourse to reduce architecture to a few renderings, give it a nickname, and call it a day? That's what's happening, and architects and critics alike should not be satisfied. So the market drive that architects need to accommodate presents some interesting circumstances and challenges for a designer that wants to please a client and the users and his overall project. So while the Bicentennial Tower sets this inquiry in motion, the heart of this issue is about the communication gap between the architect and the public. It's about architects speaking to and educating the public because their solutions are based on thorough research and a genuine desire to improve public space. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
As a former architecture critic in the mainstream media, I remember having conversations again and again with architects, thoughtful architects in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, about the way in which they felt with the beginning of sort of glamorous design coverage, that they were beginning to design these buildings, these 3D experiential things, in order to make a pretty picture. And, you know, I wonder, which seems like an unfortunate dark side of public-friendly media presentations that you're talking about. Do you think, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and that's a lot of architects now are talking about that. When they say reduce a design, or when you design, especially for a certain type of publication, does that begin to affect the design typologies that come out of it? And I think that that's a very provocative thing, and it's a question that definitely needs to be asked. But I think that, you know, given the resources that we have and the great media that we have to represent buildings, I don't think that it necessarily has to cement it into, a reductive architecture or, you know, a glamorous star architecture.
Right. Well, certainly the emergence of digital renderings as a cheap, easy thing in the last 15 years has also changed the game considerably, right? I mean, it's not just the one beautiful watercolored rendering that exists. Now there are, as you showed in the OMA case, they can redo it, revise it, and that makes it a very different ballgame.
Sure, it makes it a very different ballgame, and I think that now, especially in architecture firms and the ones that I've worked for, it's something that, you know, there's a very big love-hate relationship with it. You know, I think that architects, as easy as it is to produce, you know, like a great image, I think they also realize that it's almost empty in a way, and yeah, I think that too, I think that there's a focus and a desire to kind of step away from the rendering in practices. And what's sad is that, so that's the thing that the media wants, that's the thing that the public wants, and it's ultimately the thing that the public wants to, you know, slash down when they see it and they say, no, not in my neighborhood. So.
In the case of OMA, which I guess you focused on a lot in your thesis, and their failures to deal well with the public presentation of this proposed building, do you address the fact at all that Rem Koolhaas used to be a critic?
Well, I guess not specifically, but sure. I mean, this project in particular is so rich, and I mean, you can really open this up because it was designed by OMA New York, not OMA Rotterdam. And I know that you know, Rem presented this project himself to the politicians and to everybody in Mexico, but I have overheard him say that he does take, as a critic himself, he does kind of like to, you know, reserve himself, and he doesn't like to reveal a lot of information, and he thinks that, you know, the mysterious quality of the renderings will bring something to it. But I think that that's a nice thought to have, but I think people do need more. I think people need to understand what is going on and what will be built in their environment.
If you pursue this exploration, I would also suggest that it's in terms of the public presentation of their work before and after it's built by architects, that their actual presentational performative skills and manner is a huge piece of it. I mean, whether it's Rem Koolhaas or Danny Libeskind or any number of people who are really good at, for better and for worse, at talking to human beings, and as all of you have so far, including you, have been very good at talking to these human beings, I think that's actually an underwritten about part of how certain architects are able to build a lot and others not so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.